The alarm in my ear chimes twice, which means someone important is about to make a mistake, and I am supposed to watch it happen. I am Daniel Hartley, junior attaché to the human delegation, and I am standing in the gallery of the Galactic Senate, the moment everything changes. Ambassador Elena Vance stands at the center podium, small against the curved walls of the chamber. Around her, in tiered seats that rise like a frozen wave, sit the delegates of 900 member worlds. Chitinous Vren click their mandibles together in nervous rhythm. The gas cloud Yathiri pulse faint colors through their containment domes. And above them all, in the high seats reserved for the oldest species in the Senate, sit the Korvath, golden-eyed and patient, the way a parent is patient with a child who has not yet learned to be quiet. Elena has spent 4 years building this moment. 4 years of trade agreements, scientific exchanges, careful diplomacy, every gesture measured to prove that humanity belongs here. Today she is asking for full membership, not observer status, not a provisional seat. Full rights, full voice, full place at the table. I watch her take a breath before she speaks, and for a moment, I let myself believe this will go well. Members of the Senate, she says, humanity has fulfilled every requirement set before us. We have demonstrated peaceful expansion, technological capability, and good faith cooperation with every species we have encountered. We ask, respectfully, to be recognized as equals. The silence after her words lasts exactly 3 seconds. Then Senator Threll of the Korvath rises from his seat, robes the color of dried blood pooling around him, and laughs. It is not a polite laugh. It is not even unkind in the way that a parent might be unkind to soften a hard truth. It is genuine, delighted laughter, the kind that comes from someone who has just heard something they consider absurd, and within seconds the laughter spreads. The Vren click their mandibles in a pattern I have learned means amusement. The Yathiri ripple with mocking light. Translator boxes around the chamber struggle to keep pace with a rising tide of sound that needs no translation at all. Forgive me, Ambassador, Threll says, when he has composed himself enough to speak. But humanity has existed as a spacefaring species for what, 2 centuries? You have no psionic capability, no hive coordination. Your ships, while admittedly resilient, would not survive contact with a third-tier threat. You ask us to grant you the same voice as civilizations that have shaped the galaxy for 10,000 years. He spreads his hands, and the gesture is almost gentle, almost kind, which somehow makes it worse. Humanity is a species best observed, not consulted, he says. Perhaps in another few centuries, we might reconsider. The laughter rises again, and this time it does not fade. I find myself gripping the railing in front of me, anger climbing up through my chest, because I expected resistance. I expected hard questions. I even expected a polite refusal. I did not expect this. I did not expect a room full of beings who claim to value wisdom and patience to behave like children, mocking a smaller child on a playground. I look at Elena, waiting for her to argue. She has prepared for this. She has rehearsed responses to dismissal, to skepticism, to bureaucratic delay. I have read her notes. I know the arguments she planned to make. She does not make them. Instead, she stands very still, and something passes over her face that I will spend the rest of my life trying to describe accurately. It is not hurt. It is not rage. It is something quieter and colder, something that looks almost like relief, as though a question she had been asking for a long time has finally been answered, and now she can stop asking it. Thank you for your time, she says. That is all. 3 words, delivered evenly, without bitterness, without a final plea. Then she turns and walks toward the chamber doors, her steps unhurried, her back straight. The laughter falters. I think some of them expect her to turn around. I think some of them are waiting for the part of the story where the smaller species begs for reconsideration, where they grovel a little, where the powerful get to enjoy watching someone smaller try again. She does not turn around. She does not try again. I follow her, because that is my job, and because I genuinely do not know what else to do. Behind me, the chamber has gone quiet in a different way now, an uncertain quiet, the kind that comes when a joke lands wrong and nobody is sure why. Outside the chamber, in the long corridor that leads to the docking ring, I see something that makes my stomach drop. Every human staff member at the Senate station is already moving. Translators are closing their stations. Trade liaisons are packing files into secure cases. Junior officers like me are being waved toward the human-registered ships docked along the outer ring, and nobody is explaining why, because apparently nobody needs to be told twice. I catch up to Elena near the docking bay. "Ambassador," I say. "What's happening? Did headquarters order a recall?" She glances at me, and there is something almost gentle in her expression, the way you might look at a child asking why the storm clouds are gathering. "No recall, Daniel," she says. "Just a decision." "What decision?" "We stop asking," she says. I do not understand what she means. Not really. Not yet. I will understand it more with each day that follows. But in that moment, I only know that within 6 hours, every human vessel registered at the Senate station has undocked and departed. Every human communication channel that once buzzed constantly with trade requests, diplomatic notes, and casual messages to alien counterparts has gone silent. The human delegation's private quarters stand empty, the lights automatically dimming, as though the rooms themselves understand they will not be needed again soon. I am one of the last humans to leave the station, mostly because Elena insists I help her close out the final administrative files, the kind of unglamorous paperwork nobody else wants to handle on the way out the door. We sit together in a small office that still smells faintly of recycled air and old coffee, and I ask her the question I have been turning over since the chamber. "Aren't you angry?" She considers this for a long moment, her hands folded on the desk in front of her. "I was," she says, "for about 4 years. Every meeting where someone explained, very patiently, why humanity wasn't quite ready. Every committee that found a new reason to delay a vote they'd already decided to lose. I was angry through all of it. And now? Now I'm tired of being angry where they can see it," she says. "Anger is a performance, Daniel. It tells the other side exactly how to keep hurting you, because they can watch your face and know it's working. Walking away tells them nothing at all. I do not fully understand this yet, but I will. I will understand it more clearly than I ever wanted to. The gate route between Senate space and Sol space, the long-established corridor of jump points that has connected humanity to galactic civilization for decades, closes that night. Not destroyed, not damaged, simply closed, quietly. From the human side, the navigational beacons that guided ships along the route, going dark one by one, like candles, being pinched out by a careful hand. I am on the last transport home, watching through the viewport as the lights of the Senate station shrink behind us, and I do not yet know that this single quiet exit, this walk through a door without a single raised voice, will be remembered across 1,000 worlds as the moment everything changed. I only know that the chamber's laughter is still echoing in my ears, and that somewhere behind that laughter, underneath it, something has shifted that none of us in that room fully understood yet. The ship's engines hum beneath my feet, steady and unhurried, carrying us home in silence. I look at the back of Elena's head, 2 rows ahead of me, and I think about the way she said "thank you for your time," and how those 4 words felt heavier than any argument she could have made. Behind us, the Senate is still laughing, still telling itself a comfortable story about a young, foolish species that walked away because it could not handle rejection. They have no idea yet what they have actually done. 3 weeks pass before the Senate notices anything is wrong, and by then it is already too late to undo it quietly. I am reassigned within days of returning to Sol space, pulled from my old post in the diplomatic corps, and placed instead in something called the Threat Assessment Bureau, a department I had not previously known existed, tucked into a research campus outside a city called Cairo, on the edge of one of the older colony worlds. My new supervisor is a sharp, gray-eyed woman named Grace Whitfield, who greets me on my first morning with a cup of strong tea and a stack of files thicker than my forearm. "You were in the gallery," she says. It is not a question. I was. "Good. Then you've seen the start of it. Now you're going to help us understand the rest." I ask her what she means by the rest, and she tells me to read the files first, then ask questions, because she would rather I form my own conclusions than simply accept hers. It takes me 2 days to get through everything, and by the end of it I feel like I have swallowed something heavy and cold. The files are a record, compiled over more than a century, of every documented instance in which a human individual, organization, or government went quiet before taking decisive action. Not loud, not threatening, not building toward an explosion anyone could see coming, just quiet. A withdrawal of words followed, eventually, by movement nobody had been warned about. Some of the examples are small and almost mundane. Business negotiations where one side stopped arguing and simply walked away, only to return months later having built an entirely separate solution that made the original deal irrelevant. Others are larger, drawn from human history before the stars, periods of conflict where nations or peoples who had been vocal and demanding suddenly fell silent, and that silence was, time and again, the last warning before everything changed. The pattern repeats with unsettling consistency. Humans negotiate loudly when they still believe negotiation will work. When they stop, it is because they have already decided what comes next, and they no longer feel the need to explain it. You think that's what happened at the Senate, I say to Grace, when she calls me into her office to discuss my notes. I think it's exactly what happened, she says. Elena Vance didn't lose her temper. She made a decision, and now an entire species is acting on it in perfect unison, without a single broadcast telling them to. I find this almost impossible to believe, not because I doubt the pattern in the historical record, but because I cannot picture 11 billion people, scattered across dozens of colonies, and 100 private companies, and a government with more competing factions than I can count, somehow moving together, without a single public order being issued. Humanity has never been that unified about anything. Not really, not in my lifetime. And yet, when I start pulling the data myself, that is exactly what I find. Trade shipments that once moved constantly along the old Senate corridor have stopped entirely, not gradually tapering off, but ceasing within the same 72-hour window across every human shipping company, public and private. Scientific exchange programs that had been running for a decade quietly conclude their final sessions and do not schedule new ones. Diplomatic postings on a dozen worlds are recalled simultaneously, staff packing up their offices with the same calm, unhurried efficiency I witnessed in the corridor outside the Senate chamber. It is not chaos. It is not even visible coordination. It is simply as though some shared understanding passed through the entire species at once, an understanding that did not need to be spoken aloud because everyone who needed to hear it already had. I start watching the edges of explored space more closely, the regions where human colonies and outposts sit closest to the old Senate borders. And this is where the pattern becomes harder to explain away as coincidence. Survey drones, that once mapped resource-rich systems for trade purposes, stopped transmitting their usual reports. When I cross-reference their last known positions with shipping logs, I find that several of them simply vanish from public tracking entirely, their final transmissions cut off mid-cycle, as though someone reached out and turned them off by hand. Colonies along the frontier, small settlements that had maintained regular contact with both Sol Space and a handful of nearby alien trade partners, stopped submitting their routine census data. When Grace authorizes a discreet inquiry through a neutral logistics company, the response that comes back is polite, brief, and entirely unhelpful. The colonies are fine. They are simply not participating in external reporting at this time. What does that even mean? I ask her. Not participating. It means they were asked to be quiet too, she says, and they agreed. I think about Elena's words in that small office before we left the Senate station. Anger is a performance. Walking away tells them nothing at all. I am beginning to understand that what I witnessed in that chamber was not the end of something. It was the opening move of something far larger, something already in motion long before Elena ever stepped up to that podium, and the Senate's laughter simply confirmed a decision that had perhaps already been made. I bring my findings to Grace in a private meeting, laying out maps and shipping logs, and the strange uniform silence spreading outward from human-controlled space like ink through water. She listens without interrupting, her expression unreadable, and when I finish she is quiet for a long moment. You understand what this means for the Bureau, she says eventually. That something is being built, or gathered, she says, or moved. We don't know which. And that not knowing is the most dangerous part. A species that explains itself, even when it's angry, gives you something to work with. A species that goes quiet and starts moving in perfect coordination gives you nothing at all. I take my findings up the chain, first to the Bureau's deputy director, and eventually, after some persistence on Grace's part, to Director Edward Combs himself, a heavy-set man with a reputation for caution, who has held his position for longer than I have been alive. I expect him to take the data seriously. Instead, when I lay out the pattern, the silent trade routes, the recalled diplomats, the vanished drones, he listens with an expression of polite tolerance that I recognize uncomfortably well, because it is the same expression Senator Threll wore in the Senate chamber just before he laughed. "You're suggesting humanity is preparing for some kind of large-scale action," Combs says, "based on shipping logs and a few quiet colonies. Based on a documented historical pattern that has held for over 100 years, I say, trying to keep my voice steady. Every time this pattern has appeared before, something significant followed." "Mr. Hartley," Combs says, not unkindly, "humanity left the Senate because their ambassador's feelings were hurt. That's a diplomatic embarrassment, not a galactic emergency. I appreciate your thoroughness, but I think you're seeing patterns where there's simply a frustrated, somewhat dramatic species licking its wounds in private." He laughs as he says it, a short, dismissive sound, and something in me goes very cold, because I have heard that exact tone before, in a chamber full of golden-eyed beings who were absolutely certain they understood a species they had never actually bothered to study closely. I leave the meeting with my files still in hand, the data unconvincing to the one person with the authority to act on it, and as I walk back through the research campus toward Grace's office, I find myself thinking about all the species who quietly stopped maintaining contact with their human trade partners after the Senate vote. I had assumed, at first, that this was simply humanity withdrawing from everyone equally, but as I look at the data again that evening, alone at my desk, with a cooling cup of tea, I notice something I had missed before. Not every species lost contact with humanity. A handful of smaller, less powerful civilizations, ones who had always been treated by the Senate's older powers with the same dismissive condescension that humanity received in that chamber, are not going quiet at all. If anything, their communication with human contacts is increasing, careful and discreet, conducted through private channels rather than official Senate records. I think of a small mining collective on the rim, a species called the Doruan, barely 2 centuries into space travel themselves, who had quietly traded technical expertise with human engineers for years without ever being granted so much as observer status at the Senate. I think of a handful of free colonies, populated by species too small or too young to warrant a seat at the grand table, who had found in their dealings with humans something the Senate had never offered them, a sense of being taken seriously. These are the threads that are not being cut. These are the relationships humanity is quietly deepening even as it severs everything connected to the Senate itself. I bring this observation to Grace the next morning, and for the first time since I started this assignment, I see something flicker across her composed expression that looks almost like alarm. "They're not retreating," she says slowly, working it through as she speaks. "They're sorting, cutting away everyone who treated them as beneath consideration, and keeping close everyone who didn't. Building something, I say. Or someone," Grace says. "An alliance the Senate never saw coming, made up of exactly the kind of species the Senate has spent centuries ignoring." I think about Senator Threll's words in that chamber. Humanity is a species best observed, not consulted, and I wonder if he understood, even for a moment, the cost of being so certain he was right. Over the following days, I begin tracking these smaller civilizations more closely, cross-referencing their trade patterns, their public statements, the subtle shifts in their diplomatic posture toward the Senate's older powers. What I find unsettles me more than the silence from humanity itself, because these smaller species are not staying quiet at all. They are growing bolder, more willing to push back against Senate decisions that once would have gone unchallenged, as though they have suddenly discovered a confidence they did not previously possess. A small trade dispute involving the Dorun mining collective, one that would normally have been settled quickly in favor of the larger, more established species involved, instead drags on for weeks as the Dorun representative refuses to back down, citing technical and legal arguments with a precision and confidence that surprises everyone in the room, myself included when I review the transcript. When I dig into the Dorun's recent activity, I find evidence of extensive contact with human legal and engineering advisors in the months leading up to the dispute, contact that was never reported through official Senate channels because it did not need to be. It is not a single dramatic event that convinces me something significant is happening. It is the accumulation of dozens of small ones, each individually explainable, together forming a picture that none of the Senate's senior officials seem willing to look at directly. I bring my expanded findings to Director Combs a second time, hoping that the broader pattern, humanity's quiet realignment with the galaxy's overlooked and underestimated species, might land differently than my first warning had. I am wrong. Combs listens, nods politely, and tells me, with the same easy dismissiveness as before, that small species forming closer trade ties with a withdrawn human government is hardly evidence of anything sinister, and that I would do well to focus on less speculative work. He laughs again as he says it, and this time the sound stays with me long after I leave his office, because I am starting to understand something Grace tried to explain to me on my very first day in the Bureau. The laughter is not really about humanity at all. It is about every species in that chamber, and in offices like this one, who cannot conceive of a peer they did not personally choose to recognize. They laugh because the alternative, taking the threat seriously, would mean admitting that their judgment of what matters and who matters has been wrong all along, and that is a harder thing to accept than almost any danger they could name. I walk back to Grace's office that evening, with my files still unread by anyone with the power to act on them, and I find her standing at her window, looking out over the darkening campus, a tablet in her hand, displaying a report I have not yet seen. "There's something you should look at," she says, without turning around. "A scout vessel was supposed to check in from the edge of the old Senate corridor 3 days ago. It hasn't. I feel a chill settle over me that has nothing to do with the temperature in the room. Human territory? Close to it," she says. "Close enough that I don't think it's a coincidence." I do not know it yet, standing there in that quiet office with the last light fading outside the window. But the silence I have spent weeks documenting is about to end, and what comes after it will be far harder for anyone, even Director Combs, to laugh away. The missing scout vessel is called the Aldrich, a modest survey ship registered to a coalition of 3 minor species who had been quietly probing the edges of the old Senate corridor for resource opportunities. It is not a military vessel. It carries no weapons worth mentioning, and its crew of 6 are scientists and surveyors, not soldiers. This is, Grace tells me, exactly why its disappearance matters so much. If it were a warship that went silent, she says, we'd assume confrontation. A survey ship going dark means something else entirely. It means whoever it encountered didn't consider it a threat worth destroying, and didn't consider it worth explaining themselves to either. The Senate authorizes a second vessel, a slightly larger reconnaissance ship called the Halvorn, to investigate the Aldrich's last known position and report back. I am not part of the crew, obviously, but Grace secures us both a place in the briefing room when the Halvorn's transmissions begin arriving, because by now, even Director Combs has stopped laughing long enough to authorize official monitoring. The Halvorn's early transmissions are routine, navigational updates, sensor sweeps, nothing alarming. Then, roughly 9 hours into its approach toward the coordinates where the Aldrich went silent, the transmissions stop being routine. I am standing in the back of the briefing room when the Halvorn's captain, a steady-voiced Vren officer named Skarl, sends what becomes the final clear transmission anyone receives from the ship for several hours. His voice, translated through the room's speakers, carries a tension that no amount of professional composure can fully hide. "We have visual contact with a vessel," he says. "Configuration does not match any registered Senate design. Hailing now." There is a long pause, filled only with the faint hiss of open-channel static, and then Skarl speaks again, his voice noticeably quieter. "No response to hails. The vessel is not moving toward us. It is not moving away. It is simply present, holding position. I am requesting permission to attempt closer approach for visual confirmation of the Aldrich's location." Permission is granted. The transmission cuts shortly after, and for nearly 6 hours, the briefing room sits in a state of tense, unproductive waiting, officials filtering in and out, demanding updates that nobody has, until finally, in the early hours of the following morning, the Halvorn reappears on long-range sensors, moving slowly back toward Senate space. It is towing something behind it. The object turns out to be the Aldrich, dark and powered down, its engines cold, its hull undamaged as far as anyone can initially tell. There are no signs of weapons fire, no breach in the structure, no evidence of any confrontation at all. When the Halvorn finally docks and medical teams board the Aldrich to retrieve its crew, what they find is not what anyone in that briefing room expected. All 6 crew members are alive. Physically, by every scan and test the medical teams run, they are entirely unharmed. But none of them are speaking, not in any language, not even in the simplest distress signals their species typically use under stress. They sit, or stand, or lie where they were found, eyes open, breathing steady, and utterly unresponsive to questions, to touch, to anything at all. I am not permitted into the medical bay where they are examined, but Grace, with her bureau clearance, manages to secure access to the early reports, and she shares the relevant details with me that evening, over a meal neither of us really eats. Their vital signs are normal, she says, scrolling through a tablet with a frown that has not left her face since the Halvorn returned. No injuries, no toxins, no evidence of any device or weapon used against them. The medical staff are calling it psychological shock, but they admit they've never seen anything quite like it before. It takes 2 more days before one of the 6 crew members, a young surveyor named Tessic, finally speaks, and even then, it is only a handful of words, repeated over and over in a flat, distant voice that the medical team records and, eventually, shares with the Bureau for analysis. I am present, along with Grace, when the recording is played in a small, secure room, just the 2 of us, and a Bureau analyst whose job is to study exactly this kind of testimony. The recording is short. Tessic's voice, translated through the standard system, carries none of the urgency or panic I expected. It is calm, almost hollow, as though the words themselves have been worn smooth from repetition long before anyone thought to record them. They didn't even raise their voice, the recording says, the same sentence, again and again, with small pauses between each repetition, as though Tessic is replaying something in their mind that they cannot stop replaying. That is all. No description of weapons, no mention of injury, of threat, of anything that the Senate's existing frameworks for danger are built to recognize. Just that single observation, repeated with the quiet insistence of someone who has encountered something they have no other words for. The analyst in the room with us, an older Yathiri specialist named Carell, listens to the recording 3 times before speaking. In my experience, they say carefully, their colors shifting in a pattern I have learned to associate with discomfort. Trauma like this typically follows exposure to extreme violence, or to something the mind cannot process within its existing framework of danger. The crew shows no physical evidence of violence, which suggests the second possibility. Meaning what exactly, I ask? Meaning they encountered something that did not fit any category their minds were prepared to hold, Carell says. Something calm, something controlled, something that made it very clear, without ever needing to raise its voice, exactly how small they were in comparison. I think of Elena Vance, turning away from a chamber full of laughter, without a single raised word of protest. I think of Senator Threll's confident dismissal, a species best observed, not consulted. And I begin to understand, with a clarity that settles into my chest like something cold and heavy, that the Senate has fundamentally misjudged what kind of danger silence can represent. Grace voices the thought before I can fully form it myself. They didn't hurt the crew, she says quietly. They didn't need to. Whatever that ship was, it had already won the moment it chose not to bother explaining itself. I ask the obvious question, the one that has been building in me since the Aldrich's crew was first found unresponsive. Was it human? Carell hesitates before answering, glancing at a final piece of sensor data pulled from the Halvorn's brief encounter, a single distorted image of the unidentified vessel before it withdrew. The shape, even blurred and partially obscured by sensor interference, is unmistakably familiar to anyone who has spent time around human shipyards. The whole configuration is consistent with known human design philosophy, Carell says, though significantly larger than any vessel humanity has previously registered with the Senate, and its sensor signature does not match anything in our records. If this was a human vessel, it represents a level of capability that was either deliberately concealed from us for years, or developed with extraordinary speed following the Senate vote. The room goes quiet after that, the kind of silence that no translator box needs to render, because everyone present understands its meaning without words. I think about the trade routes that went dark within 72 hours of Elena's departure, the colonies that stopped submitting census data, the small allied species growing bolder under quiet human guidance, and I realize that what I have been documenting for weeks is not the aftermath of an insult. It is the early, careful movements of a species that decided, in a single quiet moment in a crowded chamber, that it no longer needed anyone's permission to become exactly as large as it had always been capable of becoming. Director Combs is summoned to review the Aldrich's findings personally, and for the first time since I joined the Bureau, I watch the dismissive confidence drain slowly from his face as Grace walks him through the data, the trade patterns, the silent colonies, the unresponsive crew, the single recurring sentence that Tessic cannot stop repeating. He does not laugh this time. He sits very still, his hands folded on the table in front of him, and when he finally speaks, his voice carries none of its earlier certainty. "What do we do?" he asks, and the question is directed less at Grace or me, and more, I think, at the situation itself, as though he is hoping the room will offer an answer he does not have to find on his own. Grace looks at him steadily. "We stop laughing," she says, "and we start listening, before it's too late to matter. I do not know, in that moment, just how soon we will be tested on exactly that. But within the week, the Senate votes, narrowly, and with far less confidence than it displayed in that chamber weeks earlier, to send an official delegation to the edge of human space, to attempt, before anything further is lost, to understand what has been built in the silence the Senate itself created. I volunteer to be part of that delegation before Grace has even finished reading the order aloud. The vote to send a delegation passes by the narrowest margin the Senate has recorded in over a decade, and even after it passes, half the chamber argues for another 3 days about who should be sent, as though careful committee selection might somehow undo weeks of silence. I am added to the delegation almost as an afterthought. The junior officer who first raised the alarm, included more as a courtesy than as a necessity, and I am the only person on the ship who is glad of it. The vessel chosen for the journey is the Meridian Accord, a mid-sized diplomatic cruiser crewed by a mixed delegation representing 11 species, none of them human, since by this point, no human channel will accept a Senate hailing request. Grace comes with me, the only person in the Bureau who insisted on a seat, and Director Combs, to my genuine surprise, comes as well, his earlier certainty replaced by something quieter and more careful. The journey takes 11 days, most of them spent in tense, repetitive briefings that accomplish very little beyond reminding everyone how little we actually know. I spend much of the time reviewing what data we do have, the trade patterns, the Aldrich's silent crew, the blurred image of an unfamiliar vessel built on familiar human lines, and by the time we cross into the long dormant gate corridor that once connected Senate space to Sol territory, I feel less like a diplomat and more like someone walking toward an exam he has not adequately studied for. The gate itself, when we finally reach it, is no longer dark. It hums with a quiet, steady light that suggests it has been carefully maintained rather than simply reactivated, and as the Meridian Accord passes through, the readings on every console around me shift in a way that makes several of the delegation members visibly tense. We are not alone. A single vessel waits on the other side, motionless against the backdrop of stars, and even from this distance, even with every sensor on the Meridian Accord straining to make sense of what it is seeing, the scale of it is difficult to process. It is not a fleet. It is not even a formation. It is one ship, dark-hulled, unmarked by any visible weapon array that our scanners can identify, and yet every reading our instruments return suggests a vessel built on a scale and with a sophistication that makes the Meridian Accord look, by comparison, like a child's toy drifting in open water. Nobody on the bridge speaks for a long moment. I find myself thinking, absurdly, of Senator Threll's voice in that chamber weeks ago. Your ships, while admittedly resilient, would not survive contact with a third-tier threat, and I wonder whether he has any idea, sitting safely back in Senate space, exactly how wrong he was. Hold position, Combs orders quietly, and the Meridian Accord drifts to a stop at a respectful distance, close enough to be seen, far enough to avoid even the appearance of aggression. We wait. Nobody hails us first. The silence stretches long enough that I begin to wonder if this is a deliberate choice, a final demonstration that the people on the other end of this encounter are entirely unhurried, entirely unbothered by our presence, exactly as Elena Vance was unhurried walking out of that chamber weeks ago. Finally, Grace, standing beside me at the secondary console, opens a standard hailing frequency, her voice steady despite the tension visible in her shoulders. "This is the Meridian Accord, representing a delegation of the Galactic Senate. We are requesting contact, in good faith, to discuss recent developments between our peoples." The response, when it comes, is immediate, as though someone on the other end had simply been waiting, unbothered, for us to finally find the words. The voice that fills the bridge is calm, not cold, not triumphant, not even particularly formal. It is the voice of someone speaking without any need to perform certainty, because certainty is simply what they already possess. "This is Captain Henry Calder," the voice says. "We heard you the first time. We're still listening now. The question is whether you are." I feel the words settle over the bridge like a weight nobody quite knows how to carry. Combs glances toward Grace, and Grace glances toward me, and for a moment none of us seem to know who is supposed to answer first, because every prepared statement we drafted over 11 days of travel suddenly feels inadequate against the simple, unbothered weight of that single sentence. It is Combs who finally speaks, his voice quieter than I have ever heard it. "Captain Calder, we are here to understand what has changed, and to ask what humanity requires in order to resume open relations with the Senate." There is a pause before Calder answers, not a hostile pause, but a considering one, the kind of silence that suggests the answer is not being improvised, but rather selected carefully from among several true things that could be said. "Nothing has changed, Director," Calder says finally. "That's the part the Senate still hasn't understood. We didn't become something new the day we walked out of that chamber. We simply stopped pretending to be smaller than we were, because pretending stopped serving any purpose once it became clear it would never earn us anything but laughter." I think of Elena. 4 years of careful diplomacy met with mockery in a single afternoon, and I understand, with a clarity that arrives almost too late to be useful, exactly what that pretending cost her, and what abandoning it has apparently allowed humanity to become. "What do you want?" Grace asks, her voice steady despite everything. "If not membership, not recognition through the Senate, then what?" "We want what we always wanted," Calder says. "To be left to build what we're capable of building, without anyone's permission, and without anyone's mockery either. The Senate is welcome to continue exactly as it has, governing exactly the species who chose to remain under its authority. Humanity simply isn't one of them anymore. And the species who have been working with you quietly," I find myself asking, surprising even myself by speaking up. "The Dorun, the smaller colonies on the rim. What happens to them?" There is the faintest shift in Calder's tone when he answers, something that might almost be warmth, though it is hard to be certain through the flat clarity of the translated audio. "They get exactly what the Senate never offered them," he says. "A partner who actually listens. We didn't go looking for an empire, Mr. Hartley. We went looking for the people the Senate had already decided weren't worth its time, the same way it decided we weren't, and we found out we had quite a lot to offer each other." The bridge is silent again, and this time the silence carries a different weight, less tense, more reflective, as though everyone present is finally beginning to understand the shape of what has happened, not as a threat to be contained, but as a door that is simply, quietly, closed, and is unlikely to ever be reopened on the Senate's terms. Combs straightens slightly, gathering whatever composure remains to him. "Is there nothing that could change this, Captain? No path back to cooperation?" "There's always a path," Calder says. "It just isn't the one the Senate is used to walking. It starts with treating people as equals before they're forced to prove it, not after. The Aldrich's crew weren't harmed, Director. We made sure of that. We simply made sure they understood, clearly, what they were dealing with, so that the next ship the Senate sends doesn't make the same mistake of assuming it's still talking to the species that used to beg for a seat at your table." I think of Tessik's flat, repeated words. They didn't even raise their voice, and I realize that this, more than any weapon or fleet, was always the demonstration humanity intended to make. Not violence, not conquest, simply an unshakable, calm certainty that no longer needed anyone else's approval to exist. "We'll carry your message back to the Senate," Combs says finally, and there is no argument left in his voice, only a kind of tired acceptance. "I'd appreciate that," Calder says, "though I suspect, Director, that the Senate is going to spend a long time deciding whether it actually wants to hear it." The connection closes without ceremony. No farewell, no formal sign-off, simply silence, settling back over the bridge, as the single human vessel remains exactly where it has been the entire time, unmoved, unbothered, watching us with the same patient stillness it greeted us with. As the Meridian Accord begins its slow turn back toward the gate, I find myself looking out at that solitary ship for as long as I can keep it in view, thinking about the chamber where this all began, the laughter that filled it, the 3 quiet words that ended it. I think about how certain Senator Threll had been that humanity was a species best observed, not consulted, and how completely, how thoroughly, that certainty has been proven wrong. The galaxy's great and ancient powers spent generations deciding which species deserved their attention, and which deserved only their amusement, never once considering what might happen if the ones they laughed at simply stopped needing them to stop laughing at all. I do not know what the Senate will decide to do with Calder's message when we return. I do not know whether pride will win out over caution, whether the chamber will find some way to dismiss this too, the way it dismissed every warning that came before it. But I know, watching that ship recede into the dark behind us, unhurried, untroubled, entirely sure of itself, that the galaxy has quietly, irreversibly changed, and that the species responsible for that change never once needed to raise its voice to make it happen. Behind us, humanity waits, patient and silent, exactly as it has been since the day the laughter finally stopped meaning anything to them at all.